The precarious situation. The galaxy was on the edge of disaster. The stars, which had once been a symbol of hope and unity, now represented the looming threat of war. For years, the different factions had fought over resources, territory, and power. But now, the situation had escalated to the point of no return. The entire galaxy was on the brink of total chaos, and the lives of countless beings were at stake. On one side of the conflict, the enemy had established an unstoppable fleet. The enemy's ships were massive, sleek, and powerful, with weapons that could annihilate entire planets. They had crushed every resistance that had come their way, their path of destruction leaving only ruins behind. No one had dared to challenge them. No one, until now. The human fleet, once thought to be just a myth, was making its return. For years, the galaxy had heard whispers of the humans' incredible strength, but no one had ever seen it in action. The humans had kept their fleet hidden, staying out of the spotlight, allowing others to underestimate them. But now, with everything on the line, the humans were ready to step into the war zone. The commanders of the human fleet gathered in their high-tech war room. They were fully aware of the magnitude of the task ahead. Every decision, every action would determine the fate of billions of lives. As the commanders discussed their plans, there was a quiet tension in the room. It was clear that their mission was impossible, yet they were determined to give it their all. No one could afford to fail. The galaxy depended on them. Captain Jackson, the leader of the human fleet, stood tall at the center of the room. He was a seasoned veteran, known for his quick thinking and unwavering courage. He looked at his team, his eyes filled with determination. "This is it," he said, his voice steady but firm. "We don't have time to hesitate. The enemy is coming, and we must be ready to strike." The other commanders nodded in agreement. They knew that this was the only chance they would have to save the galaxy from complete destruction. If they failed, the enemy would be unstoppable. If they succeeded, the balance of power in the galaxy would shift forever. As the human fleet prepared for battle, the enemy was completely unaware of the threat heading their way. They had already conquered most of the galaxy, leaving only a few pockets of resistance. The enemy's arrogance was their greatest weakness. They believed no one could stand against them. The human fleet, with its advanced technology and unparalleled tactics, was about to shatter that belief. Back in the war zone, the enemy's fleet was beginning to mobilize. The commanders of the enemy forces, confident in their strength, saw no reason to worry. Their ships were larger, faster, and more powerful than anything the galaxy had ever seen. They had defeated countless civilizations without breaking a sweat. They were unstoppable, or so they thought. In the heart of the human fleet, the commanders exchanged quick glances. They knew that this was only the beginning. The first phase had been a success, but now came the hard part. They had disrupted the enemy's communications, but now they had to capitalize on it. The enemy was reeling, but they wouldn't be down for long. The human fleet had to act quickly before the enemy could regain their senses. Captain Jackson gave a swift nod to his officers. "Phase 2. We hit them hard. Full assault." As the order was given, the human fleet surged forward, each ship now taking aim at the heart of the enemy's fleet. This was the moment the humans had been waiting for. With the enemy in disarray, the human ships moved in for the kill. The attack was swift, precise, and brutal. One by one, the human warships locked onto their targets and fired. The enemy, still disoriented, had little chance to retaliate. The beams from the human ships tore through their shields and armor, leaving enemy ships in flames and debris. It was as if the human fleet had appeared out of nowhere and was everywhere at once. The battle turned into chaos. Ships exploded in flashes of light, their wreckage scattering through the void of space. The once formidable enemy fleet, with its massive warships and overwhelming numbers, was now being picked apart, piece by piece. The humans were relentless, striking with deadly efficiency and disappearing just as quickly. As the human fleet tore through the enemy's lines, Admiral Vorn stood frozen, his mind racing. This isn't possible, he whispered to himself. How can they be this strong? But there was no time for doubt. The battle raged on, and the human fleet was gaining the upper hand. Every moment the enemy hesitated, every moment they wasted in confusion, was another moment the humans were winning. Jackson watched the unfolding chaos with a cold, calculating eye. "We've got them on the ropes," he muttered, barely audible to the others. "We just need one more push." And so, with the enemy reeling and the tide of battle shifting in their favor, the human fleet pressed forward, unyielding and unstoppable. This was their moment. This was their chance to prove that the myths of humanity were real, that they could change the course of the galaxy with nothing but willpower and strategy. As the battle continued to unfold, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. The human fleet had just changed the game. The shockwaves of the human fleet's unexpected attack spread far and wide, rattling the enemy forces like a house of cards caught in a fierce wind. It was no longer just a battle for victory. It was a race to survive. With the enemy fleet thrown into disarray, every officer aboard the human ships knew they had only one chance to turn the tide in their favor. This was no ordinary conflict. It was the kind of battle that would be remembered for centuries. Admiral Vorn, his face darkened with frustration, paced back and forth in the command center. His hands were clasped behind his back, his knuckles white from the strain. He had never seen anything like this before. The human fleet, despite being outnumbered, was tearing through their forces with ruthless efficiency. It was as if they knew their every move before they even made it. "We can't keep up with this," Vorn muttered to himself. "Our fleet is too disorganized, and they keep hitting us where it hurts." His officers, once confident in their superiority, were now staring at their stations, eyes wide with panic. The once grand and mighty enemy fleet was crumbling under the pressure of the human assault, their coordination failing at every turn. It was a sight Vorn had never imagined he would witness, an unstoppable force in the form of the human fleet. As the human ships continued their onslaught, Captain Jackson stood at the helm of his flagship, his hand steady on the controls. The chaos unfolding around him was no surprise. It was all part of the plan. From the moment they had entered the war zone, they knew the enemy would be caught off guard. It was their best chance to strike before the enemy could adapt. Phase 3, prepare for final assault, Jackson ordered, his voice sharp and authoritative. His officers moved quickly, relaying orders to their respective ships, ensuring that the next phase of the assault would be carried out without a hitch. The human fleet had disrupted the enemy's communication and coordination, and now they were about to deliver the final blow. Jackson knew that if they acted quickly, they could destroy the enemy fleet in one fell swoop. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the enemy was beginning to fight back. As much as the humans had gained the upper hand, the enemy wasn't going down without a fight. They started to regroup, their warships realigning their formation, trying to bring their heavy guns to bear on the incoming human ships. But the humans were prepared for this. Captain Jackson had anticipated that the enemy would try to regroup, and the fleet was already adjusting its tactics accordingly. As enemy ships began to form a new line of defense, human warships darted through the battlefield, moving with lightning speed to exploit the gaps in the enemy's formation. The key to victory was speed, and the humans had mastered it. The human fleet launched wave after wave of attacks, picking off enemy ships one by one, leaving their opponents struggling to react. It was like a dance, fluid, precise, and deadly. With each strike, the enemy fleet's defenses crumbled further, their ships falling to the might of the human assault. Admiral Vorn's face was twisted in rage and disbelief. How are they so fast? How are they anticipating our moves? But the answer was clear. The human fleet was not merely reacting. They were predicting and controlling the flow of the battle. It was a level of strategy that the enemy had never encountered before. While the enemy struggled to keep up with the lightning-fast pace of the battle, the humans were already one step ahead. As the battle raged on, the human fleet closed in on the enemy's flagship, the heart of the enemy's command. The flagship was the last line of defense, the critical point that would either seal their victory or doom them to defeat. Jackson knew this was their moment. This was the one chance they had to end the battle and bring the fight to a close. With a swift motion, Jackson ordered the final strike. The human fleet converged on the enemy flagship, their weapons primed and ready. The enemy had no time to react. The full force of the human fleet's combined might was about to descend upon them. The first shot rang out like thunder, followed by a barrage of energy blasts. The enemy flagship, once the symbol of their power, was suddenly a target, its defenses crumbling under the relentless assault. The human ships tore through the flagship's shields with ease, sending waves of destruction through its hull. It wasn't long before the flagship was engulfed in a fiery explosion, its massive form breaking apart in a spectacular display of power. "Direct hit," shouted one of Jackson's officers. "They're finished." The battle, which had started as an uphill struggle for the human fleet, had now turned in their favor. With the enemy flagship destroyed, the remaining forces were in complete disarray. The humans had broken their spirit. But even as the last of the enemy ships began to retreat, Admiral Vorn's face remained grim. He knew the war was far from over. This battle might have been won, but the fight for control of the galaxy would continue. And the humans had just proven they were a force to be reckoned with. Captain Jackson stood at the helm, staring out at the debris floating in space. There was no time for celebration. The mission had been a success, but he knew they had to be ready for whatever came next. "Stay alert," Jackson ordered, his voice low but filled with resolve. "This is just the beginning." And so, as the human fleet surveyed the remnants of the enemy fleet, the full weight of their victory began to sink in. They had taken the first step toward a new era in the galaxy, a new era where humanity would no longer be underestimated. The wreckage of the enemy fleet drifted silently in the cold, unforgiving vacuum of space. The once mighty vessels, now reduced to debris and smoldering husks, served as a testament to the ferocity of the human attack. Captain Jackson stood at the bridge of his flagship, his gaze fixed on the screen in front of him. The battle had been won, but something gnawed at him, a feeling that this victory was just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. "Report," Jackson said, his voice calm but filled with determination. His officers scrambled to relay the latest information. Damage reports flashed on the screen, but they were minimal compared to the scale of the battle. The human fleet had emerged relatively unscathed, their advanced tactics and technology having given them an undeniable advantage. Yet, despite the clear victory, Jackson knew better than to believe the war was over. "The enemy fleet is scattered," Lieutenant Harris reported. "Most of the ships have retreated, and their remaining forces are in disarray. It seems we've completely crippled their command structure." "Good," Jackson replied. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." As the last of the enemy ships fled the war zone, the human fleet began to regroup. The mood on the bridge was one of cautious optimism. Victory had been achieved, but Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The enemy had been far too quick to break under pressure. It was as if they had been waiting for something, or someone, to push them over the edge. "We're going to need to stay vigilant," Jackson said, turning to his crew. "This may be their first defeat, but I doubt it will be their last." Just then, a warning alarm blared, cutting through the silence like a jagged knife. The bridge crew immediately sprang into action, eyes darting from one station to another. "Captain, we have an incoming transmission," Lieutenant Harris said, her voice tinged with concern. "It's encrypted, very high level." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Patch it through." The screen flickered, and soon a shadowy figure appeared on the main screen. The face was obscured by a helmet, but the voice was clear, cold, and calculating. "You may have won this battle, humans," the figure said, his tone dripping with malice. "But you have only awakened something much worse. This was merely the beginning." Jackson narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" The figure chuckled darkly, sending chills down Jackson's spine. I am the one your enemy has been hiding from you, the true force behind this war. And now, you will face me." Before Jackson could respond, the transmission abruptly ended, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The bridge crew exchanged uneasy glances, the implications of the message sinking in. "Who was that?" Harris whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Jackson replied, his voice heavy with suspicion. "But we need to find out. That wasn't just some random threat. That was someone in command. And if they're behind this war, things are about to get a lot more complicated." The captain turned back to the view of the scattered enemy fleet. What had seemed like a definitive victory now felt like a mere stepping stone in a much larger game. Whoever this mysterious figure was, they had just revealed themselves as a formidable adversary. And the human fleet, despite their triumph, had only just scratched the surface of the storm that was about to hit them. "We need to be ready," Jackson said firmly. "We're going to find this enemy and take them down before they have a chance to regroup." But deep inside, Jackson knew that this was no ordinary battle. It was a confrontation with an unknown force, someone who could change the course of the war in an instant. He had no idea who they were, but he was certain of one thing: they would be the most dangerous opponent the human fleet had ever faced. In the hours that followed the unsettling transmission, the human fleet began to move with greater urgency. The once jubilant mood had quickly dissipated, replaced by a quiet determination as Captain Jackson and his crew prepared for the next phase of the conflict. They weren't just fighting a war anymore. They were facing an enemy that they knew little about, an enemy that had just revealed its ability to manipulate the flow of battle with terrifying precision. Jackson stood at the helm of the flagship, his eyes glued to the holographic display as he watched the damaged enemy ships slowly disappear into deep space. They had been routed, but something about the way they had broken so easily still didn't sit right with him. His instincts told him that the true danger wasn't the remnants of the fleet, but the one who had just threatened them. "Captain, we've finished analyzing the transmission," Lieutenant Harris said, breaking Jackson's thoughts. "The encryption was advanced, but nothing we can't crack. We've identified the source of the transmission. It came from an unknown location, deep in uncharted space. It's too far for any standard ships to reach within a reasonable time frame, but we could go there." Jackson turned sharply to face her, his gaze hardening. "No time to waste. Prepare the fleet. We're going after them." He knew the risks were high. Venturing into uncharted space was dangerous in the best of times, and the threat that awaited them could be worse than anything they had ever imagined. Yet his resolve was unwavering. They couldn't let this shadowy figure go unanswered. They couldn't let the war linger any longer, not with an unknown enemy in the dark corners of the galaxy. "We'll need to gather more intelligence first," Jackson added. "I'm not going in blind. I want every ship ready for whatever comes next." Lieutenant Harris nodded and began issuing orders, her fingers flying across her console. In moments, the rest of the crew sprang into action, their focus shifting from the victorious aftermath of the previous battle to the mysterious new threat that was about to be confronted. Meanwhile, in the command room, Lieutenant Avery was hard at work tracking the coordinates of the transmission. He was a calm, collected officer, known for his ability to decipher complex data under pressure. Yet even he couldn't hide the unease in his eyes as he worked. "We've located the source," Avery reported, his voice laced with tension. "It's a hidden facility, small, heavily shielded. It's not a military base, but it's well guarded. Whoever sent that message doesn't want to be found." "Keep analyzing," Jackson replied, not allowing the information to sway him. "We don't know what's waiting for us, but we'll be prepared. I want every tactical officer briefed and ready to engage." As the ship prepared to jump into uncharted space, the crew's anxiety was palpable. They all knew the risks they were taking. The unknowns of space were as vast as they were terrifying, and now they were about to venture into a place no one had ever mapped, with an enemy they knew next to nothing about. Still, there was no turning back. The enemy had sent them a message, And Jackson wasn't going to sit idle while some unseen force plotted their next move. Jackson took one last look out the viewports of the flagship, watching as the stars glimmered in the distance. We're going to end this, whatever it takes. He turned sharply and walked toward the command deck, where Harris and Avery were already making final preparations. The time for hesitation had passed. The fleet was ready. Jumping in 5, Lieutenant Harris said as the countdown began. The ship's engines powered up, and with a violent surge, the fleet jumped into the uncharted expanse of space. The hum of the engines was steady, but beneath it was the electric buzz of anticipation. Every officer on the flagship, every member of the crew, knew the stakes. They weren't just hunting down an enemy anymore. They were going into the unknown, with no idea of what awaited them. And worse still, they were walking into a trap set by someone who had already shown they could manipulate the flow of the war with ease. The fleet jumped into uncharted space, leaving behind the known galaxy. The sensors hummed, but the emptiness ahead was almost suffocating. But Captain Jackson had no choice. This was the only way forward. The tension hung thick in the air as the human fleet traversed the uncharted void. They had no idea what lay beyond the next star system, but Jackson's mind was focused only on one thing: confronting the enemy before they could strike again. Each ship in the fleet was on high alert, weapons systems online, shields primed, ready for anything. The unknown enemy had given them no indication of where they were, but Jackson's instincts told him they were being watched. There was no way an enemy that had already shown such cunning would leave them unguarded. With every passing minute, the uncertainty grew, but so did their resolve. Jackson's crew wasn't about to be intimidated. They had come too far and fought too hard to back down now. They were going to face this threat head-on, no matter the cost. And in the heart of space, surrounded by nothing but endless darkness, they would either find the enemy, or the enemy would find them first. The explosion of the enemy station still reverberated in the silent expanse of space. The human fleet had accomplished what no one thought possible, decimating an entire enemy stronghold in a single strike. But the victory felt hollow to Captain Jackson. The remnants of the station floated in the vacuum of space, a smoking ruin, but the true threat, the enemy's far-reaching influence, was still out there. "Damage report," Jackson demanded, his eyes fixed on the debris that slowly drifted through space. His mind was racing, calculating what came next. They had won the battle, but at what cost? "We've taken minimal damage, Captain," Lieutenant Harris responded, his voice steady despite the chaos that had unfolded. But their counterattack was strange. "There's something off about this whole operation." Jackson nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the shattered remains of the station. "I know. It's too easy. They expected us to attack, and they let us. This is just the tip of the iceberg." The silence aboard the flagship was thick with the weight of that realization. The crew had been fighting the unknown, but now, the unknown had been revealed in fragments, and it was bigger than any of them had imagined. "Sir," Lieutenant Avery spoke up, his tone urgent. "We've intercepted another transmission. It's from a different frequency. Something's not right." "Patch it through," Jackson ordered. A crackling voice filled the room, cold and calculated. "You may have destroyed our station, humans, but you've just awakened something far worse. This war is far from over." The voice sent chills down Jackson's spine. This was not just another threat. It was a warning. The enemy had something more dangerous up their sleeve, and they were ready for it. The fleet had unwittingly triggered a chain of events they couldn't yet understand. "We need to regroup," Jackson said firmly. "Get all ships on high alert. The real enemy is still out there, and we're about to face something much bigger than we've ever imagined." As the fleet gathered its strength, preparing for whatever the enemy had in store, the stars around them seemed darker, the silence more oppressive. The enemy wasn't just a force of war. They were something more insidious, something that had been waiting for the humans to make a move. Hours passed as the human fleet remained on high alert, awaiting orders. The crew worked tirelessly, analyzing every bit of data, every transmission, trying to understand what had just occurred. But it was becoming clear that the battle they had won was just the beginning of something much more dangerous. Suddenly, the sensors went off, a deep, resonating pulse echoing through the flagship's systems. A massive object appeared on their radar, moving at an alarming speed. "What is that?" Lieutenant Harris exclaimed, his voice tight with disbelief. "It's enormous," Avery added, squinting at the readout. "That thing's bigger than anything we've seen before. It's heading straight for us." Jackson stood frozen for a moment, feeling the weight of this new revelation sink in. He had known something like this was coming, but the reality of it was still hard to fathom. The enemy wasn't just hiding. They were preparing. "Bring up the shields," Jackson ordered. Now, the human fleet scrambled into action, preparing for what was certain to be the most intense battle yet. The unknown enemy had not only survived, they had evolved, adapted, and now they were coming for the humans with a force like no other. The massive object, now clearly visible on the radar, was unlike anything the humans had ever seen. It was an enormous shadowy vessel, sleek, metallic, and strangely organic in its design, as if it were alive. Its structure was unsettling, shifting as if it were part of the space around it, blending with the stars. "All ships, brace for impact," Jackson commanded. The fleet's weapons powered up, and the tension was palpable as the alien vessel loomed ever closer. Jackson could feel the eyes of his crew on him, waiting for his next command. But deep down, he knew they had crossed a point of no return. The unknown enemy had prepared a force that was ready to erase them from the stars, and now the human fleet was the only thing standing between survival and annihilation. Without warning, the alien vessel fired. A beam of energy cut through space, striking one of the human ships with devastating force. The ship crumbled, its shields collapsing under the blast. The crew screamed in the comms, their last moments filled with terror and disbelief. Jackson's heart sank, but there was no time for grief, no time to hesitate. The enemy was relentless, and so were they. "Return fire," Jackson barked, his voice rising over the chaos. "Target their weak points. Do not let them break our formation." The human fleet returned fire, unleashing a barrage of missiles, energy blasts, and laser fire, but the enemy ship's defenses were impenetrable. The attacks bounced off like rain on a rock. "This ship, it's too strong," Lieutenant Harris muttered, his face pale as he watched the situation unfold. "We're not getting through with conventional weapons." Jackson's mind raced. They needed something more, something drastic to turn the tide. But what? How could they defeat an enemy so advanced, so powerful? "We need to hit them at their core," Jackson said suddenly, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the alien ship's movements. "Find the source of their power, disable it." The crew worked swiftly, identifying the heart of the alien ship's energy systems. With the enemy pressing hard on every side, it was a desperate gamble, but it was the only hope they had left. "On my mark," Jackson said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "We hit them with everything we've got. Now." The fleet fired one final, massive blast, a concentrated attack aimed directly at the core. The energy was almost too much for their systems to handle, but they pushed through, hoping it would be enough. The beam struck the alien vessel with a blinding flash. For a moment, everything stopped. There was no sound, no movement, just the harsh silence of space. And then, an explosion. The enemy ship shattered into fragments, its core destabilized by the human strike. The human fleet had succeeded, but at a great cost. Several ships were lost in the battle, and the victory was bittersweet. "We did it," Lieutenant Avery breathed, his voice barely a whisper. Jackson stared at the wreckage of the alien ship, his mind still processing the enormity of what had just happened. But he knew this was not the end. This battle had been won, But the war was far from over. The fleet had traveled deep into the uncharted expanse of space, each passing minute tightening the grip of uncertainty around their hearts. The human warriors on board knew they were no longer just fighting a battle. They were in the midst of an ever-looming storm, an enemy whose power and cunning had already begun to shape their every move. The silence was deafening as Captain Jackson stood at the helm of the flagship. The view in front of him was a vast, empty blackness, a stark contrast to the battle-scarred systems they had left behind. He knew the enemy was close. He could feel it. "Status report," Jackson said, his voice calm but laced with tension. His crew had been working nonstop, analyzing data, rechecking weapon systems, and preparing for whatever may come. "We're getting closer to the coordinates," Lieutenant Harris said. "Our scanners are picking up an anomaly ahead. It's faint, but it's there." Jackson's gaze never wavered from the stars as they sailed past. The anomaly had been detected earlier, but it was too weak to identify. Now it was growing stronger, pulsating with energy in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, as if calling them closer. "Full speed ahead," Jackson commanded. "We're not waiting any longer." The crew followed orders swiftly, maneuvering the fleet toward the unknown. They were now entering the heart of the enemy's territory, and every instinct screamed that this was the moment they had all been waiting for. Minutes later, the anomaly revealed itself, a massive space station, cloaked in shadows, yet pulsating with strange energy, like a living organism. Its structure was unlike anything the humans had encountered before, jagged, organic-looking, and emanating a faint glow from within. "This is it," Lieutenant Avery said as he studied the data on his screen. "The station's shields are at full power, and it's heavily fortified. We'll need to hit it hard and fast." Jackson nodded, steeling himself for the final confrontation. This was no longer about strategy or tactics. This was a test of everything they had learned, everything they had endured since they first came into contact with this mysterious enemy. "Prepare the fleet," Jackson said, his voice firm. "We hit them with everything we've got. No mercy. For the safety of our people and for the survival of humanity." As the fleet advanced, the enemy station began to come alive. Lights blinked, engines hummed, and the massive structure started to shift, revealing weapons turrets and defense systems they hadn't seen before. But there was no turning back. The humans had already made their move, and they would fight with everything they had. The first strike came from the flagship, a concentrated blast of energy that collided with the station's outer shield. The force of the explosion sent shockwaves through space, but the station's shield held firm. "Shields are holding," Lieutenant Harris reported. "We need to break through before they retaliate." Jackson's pulse quickened, but his focus remained steady. This was the moment. The human fleet had already proven they were capable of incredible things, and now they would have to prove it again. "We'll need to overwhelm their defenses," Jackson said. "All ships, fire on my mark." The tension built as the ships positioned themselves around the enemy station, forming a tight formation. It was a dance of precision, each ship moving into position as they prepared for the next wave. "On my mark," Jackson repeated. His finger hovered over the command console. "Mark." The fleet unleashed everything it had. Lasers, missiles, and concentrated energy blasts all collided with the station's shields. The station trembled under the barrage, but it held strong, as if mocking the human forces with its resilience. But the humans were not deterred. Their weapons were precise, relentless, and they had one thing the enemy didn't: adaptability. As the fleet continued to push forward, Captain Jackson noticed something strange. A flicker in the station's defensive systems, a momentary lapse. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Target the weak points," Jackson ordered. "Focus all fire on that spot." The human fleet shifted, every ship adjusting their weapons to target the exposed area of the station. The barrage intensified, and this time, the shields began to crack. A loud explosion erupted from the station's core, sending shockwaves through space. The human fleet had found its mark. "We've breached their defenses," Lieutenant Harris shouted. The enemy retaliated almost immediately, launching a counterattack that sent missiles and energy blasts flying toward the human ships. The battle had turned into chaos, but despite the odds, the human fleet fought on with unwavering determination. They were winning this fight, not just for victory's sake, but for survival. As the enemy station started to break apart under the relentless assault, Jackson received another transmission, a transmission he had not expected. A voice crackled over the comms. "You think you've won?" The voice sneered. It was the same voice from the mysterious transmission earlier. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." Jackson's heart raced as the realization hit him. This was just the beginning. The enemy's true power was still out there, waiting. The station was collapsing, but the war was far from over. With one last decisive strike, the enemy station exploded in a brilliant burst of energy, sending debris scattering across space. The human fleet had emerged victorious, but they had just uncovered a much larger, more terrifying truth. The fight was not over. The fleet hovered in the silence of space, the aftermath of the battle settling over them. They had achieved the impossible, destroying the enemy's stronghold in one massive strike. But Jackson knew that their victory was only temporary. The true threat still loomed on the horizon, and the human fleet had only just begun to uncover the depths of the enemy's power. Jackson stood silently on the command deck, watching the wreckage of the enemy station drift away. The battle was won, but the war was far from finished. "Get ready," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "This is just the beginning."